It was a cold morning when the city woke up to news that no one could believe. A man had been arrested outside a small coffee shop in the heart of a quiet town. At first it sounded like just another small-town incident, something that would disappear by the evening. But this time it was different. The man who had been handcuffed and pushed into a police car wasn't an ordinary citizen. He was the Chief Justice of the country's Supreme Court, a man who had dedicated his life to law and fairness. Earlier that morning, he had left the capital city to attend a legal seminar in a nearby district. He was known for being humble, someone who preferred to drive without an escort whenever possible. His driver had stopped for fuel, and he decided to walk a short distance to a local cafe for a cup of coffee. He liked doing small things alone, feeling that it kept him grounded. He smiled at the shopkeeper, ordered his drink, and sat quietly near the window watching the morning crowd pass by. A few minutes later, a police patrol car pulled over outside the cafe. The officer who stepped out was tall and carried himself with a kind of rough confidence. He had been in the force for years and had a reputation for being strict, too strict, some said. Many people in the town had stories of how he treated them unfairly during small encounters, but no one ever challenged him. They were afraid of his badge and the authority it gave him. That morning, the officer noticed the Chief Justice from outside and assumed he didn't belong in that part of town. He watched him through the glass for a moment, then walked in. The shopkeeper froze. She had seen that look before, the officer's sharp, judging eyes that always seemed to look for trouble. "Morning," the officer said, his voice cutting through the soft music playing in the background. "What's going on here?" The shopkeeper stammered, "Just serving coffee, sir." The officer turned toward the Chief Justice, eyeing him from head to toe. "You paid for that?" he asked coldly. The Chief Justice blinked in surprise. "Yes, of course. You can ask her," he said gently, pointing toward the counter. But the officer didn't listen. "Stand up," he ordered. A few people sitting nearby started whispering. The old man at the table looked confused. He tried to explain again. "I paid for my coffee." "You can check." The officer stepped closer, his voice growing louder. "Don't argue with me. I've seen too many like you pulling tricks. Empty your pockets." The shopkeeper tried to intervene, saying, "Sir, he didn't do anything wrong. He paid me already," but the officer ignored her. He grabbed the Chief Justice's arm and pulled him up. The cup fell, spilling coffee across the table. The old man didn't resist. He just looked at the officer with calm eyes that carried both disbelief and sadness. Outside, a few people had started to gather. Someone pulled out a phone and began recording. The officer shoved the man toward the patrol car, saying things no one could believe were coming from a person in uniform. The man didn't shout, didn't argue. He simply said, "There's been a mistake. Please check with the shopkeeper." But the officer's pride had already taken over. He cuffed him, pushed him into the car, and drove away, unaware that his every move was being captured on camera. At the police station, the man was made to sit in a chair, still handcuffed. The officer filled out a report, typing fast, acting as if he had caught a criminal. The other officers in the room didn't say much. Some watched quietly, sensing something wasn't right. There was something about the man's calmness, his way of speaking. He didn't look like a thief. He looked like someone important, someone educated and dignified. The officer finally turned around and said, "What's your name?" The man answered softly, "It's better if you call your superior officer. He'll explain everything." That made the officer laugh. "Oh, really? You want me to call my boss because you think you're special?" He leaned closer, smirking. "You don't get to tell me what to do." "I'm not telling you what to do," the man replied calmly. "I'm asking you to verify who I am before this goes too far." "Too far?" the officer said mockingly. "You think you can threaten me? You're lucky I'm letting you sit there." Another officer in the corner whispered something to a colleague, both exchanging uneasy glances. They could sense something was wrong, but no one dared to speak. The man sat quietly, hands on his lap, his expression neither angry nor afraid, just deeply disappointed. After a while, the officer stepped out to make a call. He told the desk clerk to keep an eye on the suspect. The clerk nodded but didn't move. He just stared at the man, who gave him a faint, tired smile. Within an hour, word began to spread. The driver who had been waiting at the gas station finally realized something was wrong when his boss didn't return. He called the security detail from the Capitol, who then contacted the local police department. When the truth came out, everything changed in minutes. Several official cars pulled up outside the small-town station. Senior officers rushed in, their faces pale with shock. One of them went straight to the room where the Chief Justice was sitting. When he saw him handcuffed, he nearly dropped his file. "Sir, I am so sorry," he said, fumbling for the keys to unlock the cuffs. The Chief Justice didn't say anything. He just looked at the officer who had arrested him. The same officer stood frozen near the doorway, his face drained of color. The reality of what he had done began to sink in. The senior officer turned to him angrily. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" he shouted. "You arrested the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court." The room went silent. No one spoke. The officer tried to mumble an excuse, but the words wouldn't come out. The Chief Justice stood up slowly, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been. He looked directly at the officer and said quietly, "This is not just about me. This is about how you treat people when you think no one's watching." The officer lowered his head. Reporters who had followed the official convoy were already outside, cameras flashing. Someone from the crowd shouted, "He arrested the Chief Justice," and chaos broke out. The officer wanted to disappear. He tried to apologize, but the Chief Justice walked past him without another word. Outside, the scene was filled with noise and confusion. Journalists pushed microphones forward, trying to get a statement, but the Chief Justice didn't speak. He simply got into the car and left, his calm face hiding a storm of thoughts. Inside the station, the officer was shaking. He knew his life had just changed forever. The humiliation, the shame, it was all hitting him at once. The same arrogance that had driven him moments ago was gone. Now, there was only fear. By the evening, the video of the arrest had spread across social media. Millions watched as the country's highest judge was treated like a common criminal by one of its own officers. People were outraged. News anchors called it a national embarrassment. Citizens demanded an explanation, and government officials promised an immediate investigation. In homes, offices, and cafes across the country, people talked about the same question. How could this happen? How could a man sworn to uphold the law be treated with such disrespect, simply because someone judged him without knowing who he was? The Chief Justice stayed silent through it all. He refused to issue any statement. Those close to him said he spent that evening alone in his study, staring out the window, lost in thought. He wasn't angry, they said, just deeply saddened that after years of serving the law, he had become an example of its failure. The officer, meanwhile, sat in his small apartment, staring at the television as his own face appeared on every news channel. Reporters camped outside his building. Calls from his colleagues went unanswered. He thought about going to the station to explain, but he knew it was too late. For years he had used his badge as a weapon, never once thinking it could turn against him. Now he was facing the weight of his own actions. The words of the Chief Justice echoed in his head. This is about how you treat people when you think no one's watching. That night, he realized that the world had been watching all along. The next morning, the whole country was still talking about what had happened. Every news channel showed the same video again and again. A man in a suit, calm and quiet, being handcuffed by a uniformed officer outside a small coffee shop. People who didn't even know who he was were moved by how calmly he handled the humiliation. Others couldn't believe that such a respected person could be treated like that. In the police department, the air was heavy. No one wanted to look at the officer who had made the arrest. He sat in a corner staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. What had once been pride in his chest now felt like a heavy stone pressing down. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, but he couldn't answer it. Every call, every message reminded him of the same thing. His mistake had become a national disgrace. His senior officers had called an emergency meeting. They spoke in low voices, pacing back and forth. Some were angry, others frightened about what this meant for the department's reputation. The head of internal affairs walked in with a serious expression and told everyone that an official inquiry had already been ordered. "This isn't something we can brush aside," he said firmly. "The whole country is watching." The officer felt his stomach twist. He knew what that meant. His years of service, his position, his pride, everything could vanish in a single decision. At that same time, in a quiet house on the other side of the city, the Chief Justice sat alone in his study. Papers lay scattered on his desk, but his eyes weren't reading them. He was lost in thought. The events from the day before kept replaying in his mind. The loud voice, the tight cuffs, the stares from strangers, the sound of cameras clicking. He wasn't angry. He was disappointed, not just in one man, but in a system that allowed such behavior to grow unchecked. He had spent decades fighting for fairness, teaching young lawyers that justice must be blind, that everyone should be treated with dignity. Yet in one short moment he had been treated like someone who didn't deserve basic respect. When his assistant entered quietly and placed a cup of tea on the table, he finally spoke. "How long do you think this will last?" he asked softly. "Sir, the media won't let go of it anytime soon," the assistant replied. "There are protests outside the police headquarters. People want action." The Chief Justice nodded slowly. "People are angry," he said, "but anger alone doesn't change things. We need understanding and reform." He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. His mind wasn't on revenge. He wasn't thinking about punishing the officer. He was thinking about how easily this could happen to anyone else. Someone without a title, without protection, without the power to make people listen. Back at the police station, the officer was called into his superior's office. The room felt cold, the air tense. The senior officer looked at him with a hard expression. "Do you realize what you've done?" he said sharply. The officer swallowed hard. "It was a misunderstanding," he began. "A misunderstanding?" the senior officer repeated. "You humiliated one of the highest judges in the country in front of cameras, without checking the facts. You called him names. You ignored witnesses. Do you think that's a misunderstanding?" The officer didn't answer. His throat felt dry. "You've embarrassed this department," the senior continued. "You've embarrassed the entire police service. An inquiry team will question you soon. Until then, you're suspended." The word hung in the air like a sentence. Suspended. It felt heavier than any punishment he had ever given someone else. When he stepped out of the office, the hallway seemed longer than usual. Every officer he passed looked away. Some whispered to each other, but no one spoke to him directly. He felt invisible, but also painfully exposed. He went home that day to a small, silent apartment. The curtains were closed, the air felt heavy. His uniform hung neatly on a chair, the same uniform that once made him feel powerful. Now it only reminded him of what he had lost. He sat down and turned on the television. The first thing he saw was his own face. A reporter was standing outside the police department saying, "The officer responsible for the wrongful arrest of the Chief Justice has been suspended pending investigation. The Chief Justice himself has refused to comment." The officer switched off the TV and buried his face in his hands. He didn't know what hurt more, the shame or the silence. Meanwhile, in the capital city, a quiet meeting was taking place behind closed doors. Senior ministers, police officials, and legal advisors gathered to discuss the situation. The Prime Minister's secretary opened the meeting by saying, "This is not about one officer. It's about how the public sees the system. We need to act carefully." Some argued for strict punishment, others wanted to avoid turning it into a political issue. But the Chief Justice refused to attend. He said he didn't want special treatment, that he wanted the law to follow its normal process. He sent a simple note instead. It read, "Justice cannot depend on power, rank, or uniform. It must depend on truth and fairness. Let the investigation speak for itself." The message spread across the country within hours. Newspapers printed it on their front pages. People admired his calmness, his refusal to retaliate. His dignity made him even more respected. A week passed and the inquiry began. The officer was called to testify. Sitting in a room filled with senior officials and lawyers, he felt smaller than ever. Every question pierced through his defenses. "Did you verify the man's identity before arresting him?" "No," he answered quietly. "Did you listen to witnesses who tried to explain the situation?" "No." "Did the man resist or show any threat to you?" "No." "Then why did you arrest him?" He paused for a long time. His voice broke as he finally said, "Because I thought he was lying. I thought he didn't belong there." The room fell silent. The words hung heavy in the air. Everyone knew what those words meant. It wasn't just a mistake, it was prejudice, built on years of assumptions and unchecked authority. The lead investigator closed his file and said calmly, "That will be all." When the officer stepped out of the room, reporters surrounded him. Flashes from cameras hit his face, and questions flew from every direction. "Do you regret what you did?" Did you know who he was? Have you apologized? He didn't answer. He just kept walking, his head down. At home that evening, he sat by the window, staring at the empty street below. He thought about all the people he had met during his years in uniform, the frightened, the angry, the poor, the ones who couldn't fight back. How many of them had felt the same fear and humiliation he had caused the Chief Justice to feel. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be powerless. Meanwhile, the Chief Justice returned to work quietly. He didn't give interviews or make speeches, but those who saw him noticed a change in his eyes, a deeper calm mixed with sadness. He spent hours reviewing reports on police behavior, reading citizen complaints, and discussing reforms with his advisors. He wanted change not for himself, but for others who couldn't defend themselves. One evening, he met privately with the head of the National Police Service. Their conversation was short but meaningful. "I don't want this to turn into revenge," the Chief Justice said. "I want it to be a lesson. The system must learn from this." The police chief nodded, humbled. "It already has, sir," he said. "We're reviewing conduct rules, training, and accountability measures. I assure you it won't be ignored." When the Chief Justice left that meeting, he felt a quiet sense of peace. What had happened couldn't be undone, but maybe it could lead to something better. Outside the courthouse, people still gathered with banners demanding justice. But for him, justice was no longer about punishment, it was about transformation. He wanted every officer in uniform to understand that power comes with responsibility, not privilege. In the following days, the inquiry report was completed. The findings were clear. The officer had acted unlawfully and with prejudice. The department was instructed to take disciplinary action and review its internal culture. The officer received the official letter late one afternoon. His hands trembled as he opened it. He knew what it meant. His badge, his uniform, his position, all would soon be gone. But for the first time, he didn't feel angry. He felt empty but also aware. The reality of his actions had finally sunk in. He sat there for a long time, staring at the letter before whispering to himself, "I did this. No one else." Outside, the sun was setting, the sky painted with soft orange light. Somewhere across the city, the Chief Justice sat in his office, finishing another long day. The two men, worlds apart, were both thinking the same thing. How one moment can change everything, and how power without humility can destroy more than it protects. That day marked the quiet turning point for both of them. For one, it was the beginning of deep regret. For the other, the start of a mission to rebuild trust in justice. And though they hadn't spoken since that morning in the police station, their lives were now tied together by one painful truth. Neither of them could ever forget. The sun had barely risen when the news broke that the investigation was over. Every major channel reported that the inquiry team had found the officer guilty of abuse of power, discrimination, and unlawful arrest. It wasn't just about one mistake anymore. It had become a story about justice, power, and what it means to treat another human being with respect. The officer woke up that morning to the sound of his phone buzzing nonstop. Messages poured in from old colleagues, some expressing sympathy, others too afraid to say anything at all. His name was everywhere, on television, social media, even in newspapers. Every headline carried a different tone, but all told the same truth. His actions had crossed a line. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the floor. The silence around him was heavy. The small apartment that had once felt like a place of pride now felt more like a cage. He could still see the scene in his mind, the look on the man's face, calm and dignified even when handcuffed. That face haunted him now more than anything else. For years he had thought of himself as someone who kept order, someone who knew right from wrong. But that illusion had shattered. The badge that once gave him confidence now felt like a reminder of everything he had done wrong. At the station, his desk had already been cleared. The new recruits looked away as he walked past. He was no longer the respected officer, but the man who had shamed the department. When he stepped into the chief's office, there was no shouting this time, only quiet disappointment. "You know what the report says," the chief said, not looking up from his papers. "They're moving forward with disciplinary action. You'll have to appear before the board next week." The officer nodded. "I understand." The chief sighed. "You were one of our best, but this..." This was something we can't ignore. The world has changed. People see everything now. There's no room for pride without accountability. The officer left the room quietly, feeling smaller than ever. Outside, the sky was gray, matching his thoughts. Meanwhile, at the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice was preparing for another day of hearings. He hadn't spoken publicly about the incident since it happened. Some people thought he was too forgiving. Others admired his silence. But those who knew him closely understood. He wasn't silent out of fear or pride. He was silent because he believed justice didn't need anger to be strong. When one of his clerks entered to hand him a file, she hesitated before speaking. "Sir," she said softly, "the final report has been released. They've found the officer guilty on all counts." The Chief Justice nodded slowly. "I expected as much," he said. "Has he made any statement?" "None so far," she replied. "But there's talk that he might be dismissed." The Chief Justice leaned back in his chair. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly he replied, "Sometimes punishment teaches less than reflection. I only hope he learns." That afternoon he attended a meeting about police reforms. It wasn't planned because of his case, but everyone in the room knew the discussion carried new weight now. Senior officials spoke about new training programs, better supervision, and ethics workshops. The Chief Justice listened patiently, adding only a few calm suggestions. One of the officers present said, "Sir, we're also introducing regular evaluations for field officers, especially those who interact with the public daily." "That's good," the Chief Justice said. "But remember, change starts from within. You can train a man to follow rules, but unless his heart understands why those rules exist, nothing truly changes." The room went quiet. They all knew he was speaking from personal experience. Back in his apartment, the officer sat by the window watching cars pass below. He hadn't stepped outside in days. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a dull stream of light. On the table before him sat a small stack of papers, the inquiry results, the notice for his disciplinary hearing, and letters from people he had once considered friends. He picked up one letter and read it again. It was from an old colleague who had transferred years ago. The message was short. "I heard what happened. I don't know what to say except, sometimes losing everything teaches us what we never wanted to see." Those words hit him harder than the official reports. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just about losing his job. It was about losing the man he thought he was. He thought about the Chief Justice again. The image of that calm face, those steady eyes, it wasn't anger he saw there. It was disappointment, mixed with something else. Maybe pity, maybe sorrow. One evening, a knock came at his door. When he opened it, a man in plain clothes stood there holding a sealed envelope. "It's from the court," he said. The officer signed for it and closed the door. His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. Inside was a notice. He was required to appear in a disciplinary tribunal to hear the final verdict. The letter was polite, official, and brief. He sat down heavily, the paper shaking in his hands. There was no running away from it now. The day of the hearing arrived quickly. The small courtroom was filled with officials, journalists, and a few curious citizens. The officer walked in quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. His once crisp uniform was now plain civilian clothing. He felt naked without the badge on his chest. The proceedings began. The board read out the charges, the evidence, and the inquiry's conclusions. Every word cut into him like a blade. Then the chairman asked, "Do you wish to say anything in your defense?" The officer stood up slowly. His voice was low but steady. "No excuses will change what I did," he said. "I acted out of arrogance. I judged a man before I knew who he was. I forgot that my job was to serve, not to rule. I can't take back what happened, but I can admit it was wrong." The room was silent. Even the journalists stopped typing for a moment. After the hearing, the officer stepped outside into the sunlight. Reporters surrounded him again, shouting questions, but he didn't speak. He just walked away quietly down the courthouse steps into the crowd that barely noticed him. Later that evening, as the news channels replayed his short statement, people were surprised by how calm he seemed. Some said he was pretending to be humble. Others said he finally understood. But the Chief Justice, watching from his office, saw something different. He saw a man who was beginning to face himself. That night, the Chief Justice received a call from the National Police Chief. "Sir," the voice on the other end said respectfully, The officer will be dismissed by tomorrow morning. I thought you should know first. There was a long pause before the Chief Justice spoke. Thank you, he said quietly. May I ask something off the record? Of course. Tell him he doesn't need my forgiveness. He needs to forgive himself. That's the harder part. The next day, the news confirmed the dismissal. The officer's name disappeared from the official registry. He was no longer part of the force. Some celebrated the decision, saying justice had been done. Others felt a quiet sadness, knowing that one man's downfall was a reflection of a much bigger problem. The officer didn't leave the city immediately. He spent days wandering through quiet streets, avoiding crowds, trying to make sense of what was left. He visited the small coffee shop where everything had started. The same shopkeeper was there. When she saw him, she froze, unsure what to say. He approached the counter slowly. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said softly. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for that day. The shopkeeper nodded, her voice gentle. I hope you've learned from it, she said. He nodded. More than I ever thought I would. He left soon after, walking past the spot where he had once handcuffed the Chief Justice. The memory hit him like a wave, and the noise, the faces, the shame. But this time there was no anger in his heart, only regret. Far away in his office, the Chief Justice sat signing papers late into the evening. His assistant came in and said, Sir, the officer's dismissal has been confirmed. He paused for a moment, pen in hand. Then he simply said, Good. Let's hope something better comes from all of this. He didn't know that miles away, that same officer had decided to leave the city for good the next morning. He packed a small bag, took one last look around his apartment, and locked the door behind him. As he walked toward the train station, he felt a strange mix of sadness and relief. His past was heavy, but for the first time in years his mind was clear. He had lost everything, but maybe in that loss he had found something he had never understood before: humility. The train left slowly, carrying him away from the noise, the headlines, and the shame. Outside the window the city lights faded, replaced by open fields and silence. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never wear authority the same way again, and somewhere, in another quiet room, the man he once wronged prayed that someday, that realization would bring the officer peace. The story of the arrest had already become a symbol across the country. Weeks had passed, but people still talked about it in homes, schools, and offices. It wasn't just about one man or one officer anymore. It had turned into a mirror showing the flaws of the system everyone depended on. Some people were angry, others hopeful, but almost everyone agreed that something needed to change. The Chief Justice had returned to his daily duties, but something in him had changed too. He still smiled politely in court and spoke in his calm, steady voice, but behind that calmness was a quiet fire. The incident had reminded him that justice wasn't only written in books or spoken in courtrooms. It lived in everyday actions. One morning, while preparing for a conference, his assistant came in carrying a thick file. Sir, this is from the Reform Committee, she said. They've compiled data from across the country. It's worse than we thought. He looked up slowly. How bad? She hesitated before answering. Hundreds of complaints, sir. Many were ignored or dismissed over the years. Some never even made it to the record. The Chief Justice flipped through the pages. Each complaint told a story. People stopped unfairly, humiliated in public, treated like they didn't matter. None of them were as powerful as him, which meant their voices had been lost in silence. He closed the file and said softly, We can't change the past, but we can stop it from repeating. That evening, he called a meeting with senior judges and police officials. The room was filled with serious faces. No one dared to speak first. Finally, he began. What happened to me, he said, wasn't just an accident. It was a result of habits that have gone unchecked for years. If it can happen to me, imagine what happens to ordinary people every day. We need to fix this, not for me, but for them. His words carried weight. Everyone in the room knew he was right. By the end of that meeting, a new initiative was born. A national program to educate officers on fairness, empathy, and the limits of authority. It wasn't about punishment. It was about rebuilding trust. While the Chief Justice was working quietly on change, the former officer's life had taken a very different turn. He had moved to a small town by the sea, far from the noise of the city. He found work as a security guard at a shipping company. It wasn't much, but it paid enough to keep him going. His new colleagues didn't know who he really was. He told them little about his past. To them, he was just a quiet man who kept to himself. He arrived early, stayed late, and spoke politely to everyone. But at night, when he returned to his small rented room, the silence often became too loud. Sometimes he couldn't sleep. He would sit by the window, staring at the sea, remembering everything that had happened. The flashing cameras, the cold handcuffs, the look in the Chief Justice's eyes. He didn't hate the man he had wronged. He hated the man he used to be. One afternoon, as he was sitting in the security booth, he saw a group of workers arguing outside the gate. A delivery driver had been accused of damaging some cargo, and the supervisor was shouting at him. The driver looked scared and kept saying it wasn't his fault. The officer watched quietly for a moment before stepping out. "Let's calm down," he said gently. "Maybe we should check the security footage first before blaming anyone." The supervisor turned to him, annoyed. "This man broke company property." "Maybe," he said calmly, "but yelling won't solve it. Let's look at the cameras first." They checked the footage, and it turned out the driver was telling the truth. The damage had happened before he even arrived. The supervisor looked embarrassed and muttered an apology. The driver looked relieved. The officer nodded slightly and returned to his booth. For the first time in months, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had acted differently this time. He had stopped himself from making another wrong judgment. That night, as he walked home along the shore, he thought about what had happened. Maybe, he thought, this was the start of his own kind of redemption. Meanwhile, the Chief Justice continued pushing reforms quietly but firmly. He met with police trainers, social workers, and even young officers. He listened to their challenges and explained why empathy was not a weakness but a strength. One young cadet asked him, "Sir, how do you stay calm even when people disrespect you?" The Chief Justice smiled faintly. "Because anger makes you forget your purpose," he said. "When you lose your purpose, you lose yourself." The room was silent. Those words stayed with many of them long after that day. As months passed, the reforms started to show results. Police departments began holding community meetings, hearing citizens' complaints and rebuilding relationships. The Chief Justice avoided public attention, but his quiet influence was everywhere. One evening, as he left his office late, his assistant approached him. "Sir," she said, "there's a letter here for you." No return address. He opened it slowly. Inside, there was a handwritten note that said, "I don't know if you will ever read this, but I needed to say it. I was the officer who wronged you. I've lost everything, but I've also learned what it truly means to serve. You were right, respect isn't given by a badge. It's earned through humility. I'm sorry for what I did. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm trying to live differently now." The Chief Justice read the letter twice. There was no bitterness in those words, only remorse and honesty. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. For the first time since that day, he felt something close to peace. The next morning, as he prepared for court, he looked out of the window at the rising sun. He whispered to himself, maybe change really is possible, one person at a time. Far away by the sea, the former officer started volunteering at a local youth center. He helped guide young boys who were struggling to find direction. Some of them had been in trouble before. Others were simply lost. They didn't know his past, and he didn't tell them. But they listened to him because he spoke with honesty. He would tell them, "You can't control how people see you, but you can control how you treat others. Never forget that." The boys respected him. They saw in him something real, someone who had fallen and was trying to stand again. One afternoon, a local journalist who volunteered at the center recognized him. She had followed the original story months ago. At first, she was shocked, but when she saw how he treated the kids with patience, kindness, and sincerity, she decided not to report it. Instead, she wrote a short article under the title, "A Second Chance by the Sea." She never mentioned his name. When the Chief Justice came across the article by chance a few weeks later, he read it carefully. The words painted a picture of a man who had changed. When he finished reading, he looked thoughtful for a long time. Then he said softly to himself, "Sometimes justice doesn't come from punishment. Sometimes it comes from awakening." That night, both men, miles apart, watched the same sunset, unaware that they were thinking about each other in the same quiet way. The Chief Justice felt gratitude that life had shown both of them a lesson without hatred. The former officer felt humbled that fate had given him another chance to do good, and though they never met again, their story became more than just a headline. It became a reminder whispered through every police academy, every courtroom, and every training hall. Power can be taken away in a moment, but character is what remains forever. The world slowly moved on. News stories filled the news, but every once in a while, when someone spoke about justice or fairness, someone else would mention that morning in the small-town cafe, how a man of law was handcuffed, and how that single act changed 2 lives, and perhaps an entire system. For the Chief Justice, it was proof that even pain can have a purpose. For the former officer, it was proof that even the most broken person can start again, if they are willing to face the truth. The months had quietly turned into a year since that unforgettable morning when the Chief Justice was arrested by mistake. The story had slowly faded from the headlines, but not from people's memories. It had become a quiet reminder of how quickly power can shift and how important fairness truly is. The Chief Justice had moved forward with his life, though the experience had changed his outlook forever. He had grown more careful, more thoughtful in his decisions. People respected him even more now, not because of his position, but because of the calm dignity he showed through it all. His strength was not loud or dramatic. It came from how he carried himself, how he treated others, and how he refused to let anger define him. But for the officer who had once humiliated him, life was very different. He had lost his career, his title, and most of his friends. The department had quietly dismissed him after the investigation ended. There was no ceremony, no farewell, just a short letter saying his service was no longer required. He didn't argue. He didn't fight it. He knew deep down that he had brought it upon himself. He moved to a quiet town where no one recognized him. Every morning he walked along the empty road to the small harbor where he worked. He earned just enough to pay rent and buy food. The job was simple, guarding warehouses and checking vehicles, but it gave him something to do. The silence, though heavy at times, allowed him to think. He often thought about the man he had wronged. Not because of guilt alone, but because of the grace that man had shown him. He still remembered how calm the Chief Justice had been during the arrest, even when humiliated in front of strangers. That composure had cut deeper than any angry words ever could. Sometimes he replayed that day in his mind. The shouting, the flashing lights, the sudden realization of who the man was. It all came back in slow motion. He would sit at night staring at the wall, wondering how one moment of arrogance had destroyed everything he had built. But slowly, something inside him began to change. Working among ordinary people taught him humility. The fishermen he met every morning were kind and simple. They didn't care about ranks or uniforms. They valued respect, hard work, and honesty. One evening after his shift, he helped an old fisherman repair a broken net. They worked silently for a while before the old man said, "You've got steady hands. Were you always in this line of work?" The officer hesitated. "No," he replied quietly. "I used to work in law enforcement." The fisherman nodded. "That's a hard job. Takes discipline." Then he looked up and said something that stayed with him. "But the hardest part isn't enforcing the law. It's remembering to stay human while doing it." Those words struck him deeply. He didn't reply, but he carried them with him. Every time he looked at someone now, whether it was a delivery worker or a stranger asking for directions, he tried to see them not as a problem to control, but as a person with a story. Meanwhile, back in the capital, the Chief Justice continued his quiet mission to reform the justice system. He had established new training programs for officers and encouraged open dialogue between police and communities. It wasn't easy, change never was, but little by little, progress started to show. He often reminded his colleagues, a nation's strength isn't measured by how it punishes, but by how it protects the innocent. One afternoon, while reviewing a report, his assistant entered the room with a document in her hand. "Sir," she said softly, "the case regarding the officer has been officially closed. He was found guilty of professional misconduct. The final papers just came in." The Chief Justice looked at the document for a long moment, then set it aside. "Justice was served," he said quietly, "but I hope he finds peace. Punishment is temporary. Regret lasts much longer." That evening, after leaving work, he walked through the park near his office. The air was cool and children were playing under the dim streetlights. He sat on a bench watching them laugh. For a moment, the noise of the world faded away, and all he could hear was the simple sound of joy. It reminded him why justice mattered, not just for laws, but for people's ability to live without fear. Days turned into weeks, and the officer's life continued in the seaside town. One morning, while he was sweeping near the warehouse gate, a police patrol car stopped nearby. Two officers stepped out to check the area. The sight of their uniforms made his chest tighten. He felt a pang of shame, as if the past had come back to confront him, but one of the young officers smiled politely and greeted him. "Morning, sir," he said. "We're just checking the docks for security updates." The former officer nodded. "Of course," he replied, keeping his voice steady. The younger officer looked curious. "You seem like someone who's done this before," he said with a grin. He smiled faintly. "Yes, once. Long ago." When they left, he stood there for a long time, staring at their car disappearing down the road. He realized that even though he would never wear that uniform again, maybe he could still serve the same purpose in another way. That night, he took out the letter he had written to the Chief Justice, the one he had mailed months ago. He reread his own words and felt something shift inside him. He no longer wanted to be the man who lived in regret. He wanted to do something useful again. So he started visiting schools and small community centers, offering to speak to young people about discipline, responsibility, and fairness. He never mentioned his past in detail. He simply said, "I've made mistakes and I've learned that the smallest choice can change your life." The young people listened to him because he spoke with honesty. He didn't pretend to be wise or perfect. He just spoke from the heart. Word spread, and soon other towns invited him to speak too. He didn't get paid much, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt that his voice had meaning again. One day, a local newspaper published a small piece about his community talks. The headline read, "Former Officer Teaches Youth About Compassion." There was no mention of his past, no reference to the scandal, just a story of a man trying to make a difference. When the Chief Justice saw the article, he recognized the man in the picture immediately. He studied the photo carefully. The once arrogant officer now looked older, humbler but also lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. He smiled quietly and said to himself, "Maybe that's what justice truly looks like, not in punishment, but in transformation." Weeks later, during a national justice conference, he was asked to give the closing speech. As he stood on the stage, he looked at the large audience of judges, officers, and students. He spoke from the heart, not from his notes. "I once faced injustice firsthand," he said calmly. "But I learned that real justice is not revenge, it's awakening. It's the moment when a person realizes the weight of their actions and chooses to change. We must build a system that not only corrects mistakes but prevents them by teaching empathy." The audience stood and applauded. Some even had tears in their eyes. Later that evening, as he left the hall, he looked up at the night sky and whispered a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for everyone who still believed that kindness and truth could coexist with authority. Far away, in the seaside town, the former officer sat by the shore, listening to the sound of waves. He didn't know that his story had been mentioned in the Chief Justice's speech that night. He didn't know that the man he had once wronged now spoke of him not with anger, but with hope. He just sat there staring at the horizon, thinking of how life had come full circle. He had lost everything he once thought mattered, but in the process, he had found something far greater: peace of mind. And though he never sought forgiveness again, he had finally forgiven himself. The night wind brushed his face and he closed his eyes, whispering softly, "Maybe it's not too late to become the person I should have been all along." The sun was just rising over the city as the Chief Justice stood near his window, watching the soft light spill across the rooftops. His office was quiet. The city was waking up slowly, the sounds of cars beginning to hum in the distance. He took a deep breath, feeling a strange peace inside him. It had been almost 2 years since that unforgettable morning when his life changed. The memory of being arrested still lived somewhere deep in his mind, but it no longer hurt the way it once did. Now it served as a reminder of how fragile dignity could be and how strong forgiveness could become. He turned away from the window and walked to his desk. There were new files waiting, new cases to review, and new challenges to face. But on the corner of the desk he kept one simple letter, the one he had received from the former officer. It had been months since he first read it, yet he still hadn't thrown it away. He didn't know why. Perhaps it reminded him that even the worst moments could lead to something good. He sat down, reading through the papers in front of him, but his mind wandered to the quiet seaside town where he imagined the officer must be living. He often wondered how the man was doing, not out of judgment, but out of a quiet hope that he had truly changed. That afternoon, after his court sessions ended, the Chief Justice attended a conference at a nearby university. The event was about restoring trust between citizens and law enforcement. Students filled the hall, eager to hear him speak. He stepped up to the stage, his calm presence commanding the room without effort. When he began to speak, his voice was soft but full of conviction. Justice, he said, is not just about punishment. It's about understanding. It's about reminding ourselves that power is borrowed, not owned. The way we treat others defines who we truly are. The audience listened closely. Some students took notes, others simply watched him, moved by his words. He continued, "Many people think justice is only about law. But it begins much earlier, when we choose to listen instead of assume, to help instead of harm. When we act with empathy, justice has already begun." When he finished speaking, the crowd gave a standing ovation. But the Chief Justice didn't smile out of pride. He smiled out of gratitude, grateful that his pain had not been wasted. It had taught him something that no book could. Meanwhile, far from the city, the former officer sat at a small wooden desk in his modest room, writing notes for another youth session. He had started visiting nearby towns to speak at schools and community halls. His talks were simple, honest, and always ended with the same message. Kindness doesn't make you weak. It makes you strong enough to see others as equals. People began to respect him for the man he had become, not for the mistakes he had made. He still carried guilt in his heart, but it no longer ruled him. It had turned into something else. Wisdom. One evening, after finishing a talk at a local school, he sat on the steps outside while the sun dipped below the horizon. A young student came up to him, hesitant but curious. "Sir," the boy asked, "why do you help people like us?" "You could be doing something else," he smiled gently. "Because someone once showed me mercy when I didn't deserve it," he said. "That changed me. Now it's my turn to do the same." The boy nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but sensing the depth behind those words. The man watched the boy walk away, then looked up at the darkening sky. He thought about how strange life was, how one mistake had destroyed him yet also built him again in a better way. A few months later, an invitation arrived in the mail. It was a formal envelope bearing the official seal of the Supreme Court. Inside, a short letter read, "Dear Sir, you are invited to attend the National Forum on Justice and Humanity as a guest speaker. The Chief Justice personally requests your presence to share your experience on reform and redemption." He read the letter several times, unsure if it was real. His hands trembled slightly. For a long time he sat there in silence, the paper resting on his lap. He never thought he would ever step foot near a courthouse again, let alone by invitation from the man he had wronged. After a long night of thinking, he decided to go. On the day of the event, he wore a simple gray suit, the same one he had saved for years, neatly pressed though a little worn. He took the early train to the Capitol, watching the scenery roll by. Each passing mile felt like a step closer to closure. When he arrived at the Grand Hall, his heart pounded. The place was filled with judges, lawyers, officers, and scholars. He felt out of place, but no one seemed to recognize him. Then he saw the Chief Justice standing near the podium. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Neither spoke, but in that silent exchange, something deep passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that the past no longer stood between them. When it was his turn to speak, the hall grew quiet. He stood behind the microphone, looked around, and took a deep breath. "I was once an officer," he began softly. "I believed authority made me better than others. I was wrong." Murmurs spread across the room, but he continued calmly. "I made a mistake that hurt someone deeply. That day I lost my career, my respect, and almost my humanity. But losing everything forced me to look at myself honestly. I realized that justice isn't about power. It's about responsibility. It's about protecting others, not controlling them." The audience listened intently. There was no anger in his tone, only truth. "I'm not proud of what I did," he said, "but I'm grateful for what it taught me. I learned that forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It gives you a reason to become better." When he finished, there was a long silence. Then slowly the room filled with applause. Some people even stood. He didn't know where to look. His eyes found the Chief Justice again, who nodded once, calm, kind, and full of quiet respect. After the event ended, the Chief Justice approached him. The crowd gave them space, sensing the weight of the moment. For a few seconds, they just looked at each other, both searching for words that didn't need to be spoken. Finally, the Chief Justice said softly, "You've done well." The officer lowered his head slightly. "I never expected your forgiveness." The Chief Justice replied, "Forgiveness isn't something I give, it's something you earned by changing." For a brief moment, both men stood in silence. Then the Chief Justice extended his hand. The officer hesitated, then reached out and shook it. The handshake was firm, steady, and full of understanding. In that moment, the story that had begun with humiliation and anger finally ended in peace. Not because time had erased the past, but because both men had learned from it. Later that evening, as the Chief Justice drove home, he thought about the strange ways life worked. He remembered his early days as a young lawyer, full of ambition but not yet wisdom. He realized that sometimes life teaches the hardest lessons through the most painful moments. And miles away, the officer walked along the same shore he had walked 100 times before. But this time his steps felt lighter. The sea breeze brushed against his face, and for the first time in years he felt free, not from the world, but from himself. He stopped and looked at the horizon where the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. He whispered quietly, "Maybe forgiveness isn't something you ask for. Maybe it's something you live for." The waves rolled gently onto the sand as if agreeing with him. The Chief Justice, sitting in his home office, opened his drawer and took out the old letter once more. He read it one last time, then folded it neatly and placed it in a new envelope. On the front, he wrote only one line. "Sometimes justice begins when forgiveness is complete." He sealed it and placed it inside a file marked Reform and Humanity. It wasn't meant for any court record. It was meant as a memory of how far both men had come. Their lives, once bound by anger and pride, had become symbols of what true change looked like. Not through revenge or punishment, but through understanding, humility, and growth. The story of their encounter would be told for years, not as a tale of shame, but as one of transformation. And as the night fell over the city and the waves whispered along the shore, both men, one in the city, one by the sea, closed their eyes with a quiet heart. They didn't need to meet again. They had already found peace.